This is House Planning Help episode 117. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that might get in our way. My personal goal is still to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 this coming August, and today my guest is serial self-builder David Snell. We're on the subject of land again, this time round, what to look for in a plot of land. And I have been searching not so much land this week, more existing properties that could be demolished. And I've looked at 3 bungalows. One was a very easy no. The other 2 were definitely projects. But I still feel a bit funny when I look at a building and think, do I want to flatten this? I'd much rather just have a patch of open ground. I'm sure the carbon count on this is not going to be good if I knock it down. So we still must do that episode on demolish and rebuild. But I also sense my wife is getting frustrated by this process. It's a lot slower than buying another house and just moving on. And I think I've mentioned this before, that I can understand why other people might have just given up at some point. In fact, I know I've heard of people who have stopped and just thought, this is crazy, I'm wasting my time. So yes, a good motivational guest today, David Snell. He's the author of Building Your Own Home. He's also been a regular contributor to home building and renovating over the years. We chatted to him last in episode 50 when we discussed hiring a contractor or subcontractors, but he's certainly well known for helping people out with finding land and good tips. So this is going to be a lot of value. Say we find a plot we like, how do we appraise that plot? Let's get into the interview. The last time I spoke to him, he was underway on his final self-build.
Yes, but it didn't quite work out that way because we decided that we didn't really want to live in Kent. We had a lovely plot. It was a super plot and it was a super place, but we decided that Kent wasn't for us and that we wanted to go back to Gloucestershire where our grandchildren are. And also where we knew everybody. And in particular, from my point of view, I know every single builder and every single subcontractor. And so that if I want a plasterer or a plumber or an electrician in the middle of the night, I know exactly who to ring there. Whereas here, I always felt at a sort of loose end, to be honest.
That's interesting that you clearly value those relationships.
I think one of the keys of success of a self-build, quite apart from the fact of finding the plot and everything like that, the next biggest key is really having a decent relationship with a builder or subcontractor. Because if you haven't got that bit right, then all the bits that went before, finding a plot, getting the planning permission, getting the design, all of that goes up the wall.
I'd like to talk to you today about when we come to a plot and we're trying to work out, is this a good plot, and some of the things that we might need from it. So where would we get starting? If you'd seen something you like, what would you be looking at?
Well, I never stopped learning. I've looked at plots all my life, and writing for the magazine on Plot Finder Challenge, I looked at plots sort of on a regular monthly basis throughout the country, and it never ceases to amaze me that you come around the corner and there is the dross, and then you come around another corner and there's something that makes your jaw drop to the floor. And I've never really bothered. I've always gone out before looking for single plots, and this time I went out looking for single plots and asked the agents how I work when I want a plot. If this is any interest of you, how I work is a bit like a fisherman. In fact, fisherman doesn't just put his bait on the hook and chuck it into the river. He actually picks up a handful of bait or maggots or whatever and throws them in as ground bait, and attracts all the fish to where he's going to be fishing. Then he throws his hook and line in. And that's what I do. I put the bait out. I talk to as many people as I can, architects, solicitors, estate agents, other builders, developers, local people I know, everything like that. I'm going to be looking for a plot soon. I'm going to be back here in earnest in a few weeks' time or a month's time, and I'm going to be earnestly looking for a plot. And hopefully you'll have something for me when I come back. And that's how I've always done it, and that's how I did it this time. I went and, as usual, looked at a few single plots. One of them was very passable. One of them you'd have to be a mountain goat to live there. And then there was another one, which was a double plot. Now, I've never really gone after double plots. It suddenly occurred to me that this is a brilliant idea for self-builders, because most self-builders know another person who wants to build as well. And that's exactly what I did. I saw this double plot. It's too much for me. I don't want 2 plots of land. I mean, if I was really rich, I'd have both and have a big garden. But what do I want a big garden at my age anyway? Anyway, I bought this double plot. I said yes to this double plot. We had to sort of shift some money around in order to get the double plot. And I immediately sold it on for a £10,000 to £15,000 profit. The single plot that I didn't want. In fact, I went one better than that, because we're just talking about building relationships. I knew a builder in the area, and I'd called him to have a look at the plots, and I said to him, what are we talking about building this plot for? And he told me the value for building the house I want was just about the same as the value for the plot. So I thought, well, and he said, I'd like that plot. And I've got to raise the money then. And I said, well, there's no point you paying me some money only for me to pay it back to you. Why don't we just do a deal whereby you build the house and I'll give you the plot? And that's the arrangement I've come to. I've sold the plot to him for £1. He's taken out a mortgage with me for the value of the plot. That is redeemed when he builds the house, or else a backstop date comes into play. And it seems to me that's I'm quite excited about that arrangement. It might seem new, but I've actually done that before. I did it before in a double plot in Kent, but in reverse. Then I was the builder, and somebody came to me and said, I've got this small bungalow on a large plot. Can you build me a new house, and you can have the other plot? And that's what I did. So it was a spin-off from that. And that was 20 years ago.
Have you ever bought a bungalow for demolition or something much smaller? So when you come and look at those, what are you actually interested in if you think this is a demolition?
You're always interested in the same thing whenever you look at any plot, be it greenfield, brownfield, greenbelt or replacement. You're always looking, is this in the area I want? Is the approach right? Are people going to like driving up to this plot, because to this house I build on this plot? What's its curb appeal going to be? All of that comes into play wherever the plot comes from. But with replacement dwellings, you're looking at the neighbourhood, perhaps a little bit more than you would with a greenfield plot, because greenfield plots tend to create their own environment, but the environment's already fixed with a replacement dwelling. So if you're looking at a replacement dwelling, you must never forget, we all need our houses to have some value, and we all rely on our neighbours sharing those values. If you buy a plot next door to or in vicinity of neighbours who don't share your values, who think that cars look better up on piles of bricks than wheels, and chuck old things and everything in the front garden, then they're going to devalue your house, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't say, I don't like that bed in your front lawn. Can you move it? Because you can't force them to. So they need to share your values. So with replacement dwellings, you really need to look even more rigorously at its immediate surroundings and its approach, which is important, because it could be lovely when you get to the plot, but if you've got to drive through somewhere horrid to get it, people's spirits have sunk by the time they get there, and so has the value of your home. But the replacement dwellings nevertheless have, I think probably they're one of the best sources of plots in the normal course of events, simply because of so much infrastructure there. I mean, if you buy a replacement dwelling, it probably costs peanuts, a couple of 3,000 at the most to take it down. There's probably salvage value in it as well, so the demolition is virtually nil. But there's so much there that's really, really good. You wouldn't have to put the driveway in. You won't have to bother with crossovers. You might not have to bother with cutting up a road to put sewers in things. The electricity will be there, the gas will be there, the water will be there. All of that infrastructure will be there. And on top of that, the garden's probably done, the fences are in, and the trees are planted. So there's so much that you haven't got to do.
You raced through some brilliant things there, so I want to slow down, go back. Where we start... Well, you know it all. When we look at that plot, then I don't know where we should start. Is it the services that you might first want, or is it looking for a flat piece of ground? Or let's start going into some of those.
It's always, a plot sings to you. It's what you're after. If you've lived all your life in an urban street or a city environment, and what appeals to you is pavements and the odd tree sticking out of a hole in it, then you're looking at facilities, you're looking at where the nearest theatre is and everything like that. If you're looking for a rural plot, you're looking for, have I got the views? Have I got the neighbours? Is there forest that I want to walk in close proximity? All of that sort of thing. So there are different things to different people. It's what sings to you. It has to sing to you. It has to call out to you and say, I'm for you.
Right, I haven't had that. It's really interesting you saying that. Perhaps on the first, or we put in 2 bids, and on both of those, I could have thought, I could live here, this is going to be good. But I haven't really had that deep down, wow, this is it, I've got to have this.
And I think you need that. Because if you're going to do it, especially as a couple, then it has to sing to 2 of you, quite frankly. And on this current plot, we pulled up at it over the weekend. The vendors were away. We couldn't get on the plot because it's high hedges. We stood there and we just looked at each other, and Mrs. Snell said to me, I want this. And I said, so do I. And we moved heaven and earth to get it because it sang to us both.
Quite interesting too that we've gone through this stage now, we've got a connection there. So is everything else really just, it's paperwork and getting things to a point where we get things like our services and that you've mentioned, all these other things?
All of that follows on. I like this place. I want to live here. This is where I can see my new home. That's number one. After that, you start filling in the details. Are the services available? Well, they may not be. But it's not impossible to get them there, and it's not impossible these days to live off-grid as well. The most important thing is, obviously, has it got planning permission? And will I be able to build what I want? And that's, once you've seen the plot, this I like, then you'd start, the first detail you'd look at is the planning permission, I think, and what it's got planning permission for. I don't advise anybody as a lay person who wants to build their own home to start speculating on buying land and hoping to get planning permission for it. Never, ever touch land until it's got some sort of express planning permission in outline or detailed form. But even whatever it's got, whatever planning permission it's got, the chances are that you can change that planning permission, that you can make what you want on it, subject, of course, to the local authority and the planners. Current plot, for example, case in point, had planning permission for a 3-bedroom sort of dormer bungalow thing. It wasn't and isn't what we wanted to live in. So we changed that. First thing I did is mince down the local authority and saw the planning office and said, this isn't what I want, this is what I want, what do you think of it? In actual fact, they loved it because I had realised that by reading the what had gone on before on planning, that they were rather concerned that the street scene was being filled up a bit too much, shall we say. And so what I was doing was designing a house which created more open space on a less visual impact, if you like, and so they loved it and they accepted it. But if you're trying to do in reverse that, if for example, it's got something planning for something small and you want to build something great big, then tread with care, because you could go down the planning officer and they could say, well, no, this is as much as we want on here. In that case, the plot's not for you. If you can't build what you want on there.
Sometimes I see a drawing in, if I'm looking on Plot Finder and things like that. So is that really that's a cookie cutter of what could be there, and we shouldn't worry too much about that, just so long as it's got one of those planning permissions?
Right. Planning permission has given the land a value. The value of the land gets is based upon the house that can or will be built upon it. So that otherwise it wouldn't have any value other than just garden land, which is £1,000 at the most. So it's planning permission that gives the plot its value. But nevertheless, all planning permissions these days, even out in outline, have some form of design on them. You can't get outline planning permission. In the old days, you could just get outline planning permission in blanket. It has got outline planning permission. These days, you have to have provided some details of the design, the height, width, and appearance of the property. And so it gives you an indicator. You're never going to get less than that. It's whether you're going to get more that's the question. You're never going to get less than that unless you want less than that. If it's got planning permission for a 3-bedroom bungalow, and you only want a 2-bedroom bungalow, chances are nobody's going to argue. But if it's got planning permission for a 3-bedroom bungalow and you want to build a 5-bedroom bungalow, then you're starting to argue things upwards. And that can, in some instance, be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. You may have to do things incrementally. You may have to go softly, softly catchy monkey and build your 3-bedroom bungalow and then one day extend it or build a bit more on it or use your permitted development rights or whatever.
Can we talk about conditions? Because when you have planning permission, you're going to have some conditions. And I know I've heard you in the past talk about discharging them. So please explain this area.
Okay, all planning permissions have conditions. Some of them are the normal ones, like time limiting. All planning permissions are time limited for a start. If you're offered any piece of land, I think it's number one on most planning permissions, when it will expire. Take a good look at that one, because planning permission is time limited. And if you're buying a piece of land and you've got work to do on either discharging conditions or changing of the plans to something you like, then there has to be enough time for you to do that within that before the planning permission expires. Otherwise, you could be finding yourself without planning permission on a piece of land. So that's very important. The time is the most important one. There will be then maybe up to 30 other conditions in some cases. A piece of land I had in Lydd had 25 conditions on it. And they have to be read and carefully looked at, because all of those conditions have to be discharged at some point. Now, some of them are discharged in the normal course of events of getting planning permission, getting building regs and everything like that. But some of them will be worded that they must be discharged prior to any commencement of work, which means you cannot start work without having those conditions already discharged by the local authority. Some good things have happened on that, because planning officers were taking ages and ages to discharge conditions. And I had a case in point with a plot of mine where the consent was, in fact, threatening to run out whilst they were still considering discharging a normal condition. It was just a condition on external materials, and they just would not make their mind up. That's all changed recently. Planning officers, planning departments now have 8 weeks in which to discharge conditions. And if they haven't given you a discharge within 6 weeks, then you give them 2 weeks notice. And if they still haven't given you a decision on those, then the condition is deemed to satisfy.
I'm probably going to show that I really don't understand how this works, but who is setting up these conditions in the first place? Is it not the people who are discharging them?
It is. It's the same people. It's normally done at officer level. And at officer level, they would, for example, there may be a condition that, the normal condition that you'll come across is that prior to any commencement of work, agreement should be obtained from the local authority as to which brick you will use, which tile you will use, what colour your windows are, what they're made of, and everything like that. So you then have to get into this long, involved process with the planning officer who put those conditions on as to what sort of bricks they want, what sort of tiles they want, etc. And they, in turn, when you submit samples of your bricks and say, this is the brick I think I would like to use, this is the tile I would like to use, they, in turn, may then go to their conservation officer or other bodies and say, what do you think of this? He's planning to use this. And this can go on interminably. Now, as I say, it's time limited. They have to give you a decision within 8 weeks. I mean, they could give you a negative decision because they simply can't make up their mind. So they could give you a negative decision. If they don't give you some sort of decision, if you submit an XYZ brick and they don't give you a decision in the 8 weeks, then it's deemed to satisfy.
What are pre-apps?
Pre-apps were invented because somebody thought that it would be a great idea if planning officers and planning people and people making applications for planning, everyone involved in the process, would stop wasting their time on frivolous or vexatious applications which had no chance and it would be an opportunity for planning officers in particular to influence what sort of application was eventually going to be received. Planning departments charge for this. Some of them charge quite heavily, in fact, several £100 for this pre-app. The fact is, though, that nothing that a planning office says or a planning officer says or a planning department says verbally or in writing is binding on that local authority unless it is a determination. So that you could have reams of stuff back from a planning officer after a pre-app saying, I think you should do this and do the other, and it's all absolutely conjecture. Quite frankly, A lot of opinion in the industry and people who work in the industry is that pre-apps are just a complete waste of time and money.
I love finding out all of this stuff. Okay, let's go back to the plot then. And access is obviously going to be a key thing. What do we need to look for in terms of access, both for cars, I suppose, and us coming on and off?
Well, for most people, access means vehicular. If you're building in an urban environment, no, it's just pedestrian. But in most people, there's got to be some sort of vehicular access to the property. There has to be some access for construction as well, by the way. It's something that a lot of people forget. You know, it's all very well to say you've got a 2.5 metre driveway, long 2.5 metre driveway to your plot, and everything's going to be hunky-dory when it's built. But unless you've got helicopters bringing everything in, it's going to be frightfully difficult to build. So access for construction. But access is important because, as I say, in most cases, without access, it ain't a plot. And so you've got to look at that. In many cases, plots, in most cases, to be honest, plots have direct access to the Queen's Highway. And that isn't a problem. It may be to the metalled highway or it may be to the grass verge, which is within the highway. And that isn't a problem. You can get access, and it wouldn't have got planning permission unless it could demonstrate that access. There's something to remember here, though, that planning permission, and it's important, anyone thinking about building a home should learn as much as they can about planning permission. And one maxim to remember is that planning permission says you may build something, it doesn't say you can. So you may have, for example, a plot which has got a lovely long driveway giving access to this plot, going past these few houses and everything like that, and everything's going to be hunky-dory, and the planners are happy with that, and it's got planning permission. But if it doesn't have a legal right over that, what may be a private driveway, then you can't operate that planning permission. And just because you've got planning permission, it can't override that lack of a legal right. And so whether you've got legal right of access over other people's land is important, because if you haven't got that, then it's an inoperable plot.
I looked at one that had some issue. It was a lane that went there, but I think the council who was selling the land had insurance against that. Is that...
This is entirely possible. Land gets bought and sold all over the places. Bits of land get carved off from other bits of land and sold, and bits get left behind. And somebody doesn't think ahead about the consequences of sales and resales and things like that. Case in point, I had a double plot in Rolvenden in Kent, and there were 18 houses on that road, but nobody knew who owned the road. Just time; it had been left by time. Equally, nobody was going to get out on that road and suddenly build a wall across it and stop everyone getting access to their houses. They would have been knocked down before they'd got it half built. So what do you do about that situation? So quite simple. A single premium indemnity policy, a couple of £100, will insure you against somebody coming along and saying, oh, you've got no right to drive over here, I happen to own it, things like that.
Let's move on to trees. I know that they're brought up a lot, but what do trees tell us about a plot? And if a tree has been removed, why is that relevant?
Trees are very important. First of all, trees will tell you a lot. You need to know about subsoils and things like that when you're building a house. So trees will give you an indication of the kind of subsoil you're going to come across. If you've got a beech tree, the chances are you've got chalk underneath. If you've got an oak tree, the chances are you've got clay. If you've got older trees, your chances are you've got heavily waterlogged land, etc. If you've got things like willows and poplars, then their root systems can be injurious, actually physically injurious to property. The other thing is that if you've got clay and the presence of trees, which is in a lot of the southern part of the realm, then you've got to be very careful of something called heave. Trees take up enormous amounts of water from the subsoil. The soil beneath a tree, a large tree, will be completely friable. You can crumble it in your hand. Take that tree away, and the tree has stopped taking the water from the soil, and the soil becomes waterlogged again. If it's clay, clay has one volume when dry and another volume nearly twice as big when it's wet. And what can happen is that the clay can expand, and it causes what's called heave, and that can break a house in two. And I've seen that happen, by the way. So you've got to be very careful with the presence of trees to houses and particularly their removal in clay situations. It's not impossible. Again, it's why I said looking at the plot and saying, is it the one for me, and then sort out the details later. It's not impossible. Your contingency will take into account the fact that your foundations, because of the presence of trees and clay, are going to cost that little bit more. Not a lot more, in terms of total percentage of the cost, maximum 10% of the total percentage of your cost. In absolute worst case, to be honest.
And there are tree preservation orders just in everywhere or in some areas?
That's a planning issue. So we were talking, that was the physical side of things with trees, but there is also the planning side of things, the emotional side of things. People get very, very emotional about trees. People want to hug trees and people want to live in them and things like that. And people like trees, and trees are very nice. And planners are very insistent that trees remain wherever possible. It's not always possible, and sometimes that's a bit of a problem. If there is a tree preservation order, then it is very difficult to do things about it. It's not impossible, again. You can go to the arboricultural officer, very difficult to say, and negotiate with them about removing one tree and maybe replacing it with another, perhaps a better specimen. If it's a sycamore or something, which are basically a weed tree, and you say, but wouldn't it be lovely to have an oak tree there, but we'll put it just over there so that it won't affect the house. That's the sort of negotiation you can get to. But if you cut down a tree with a TPO or a group of trees with a TPO on them, then you're in dead trouble with the planners.
Neighbours. I know that they're not necessarily on our plot, but they do affect us as we go through. So what do we need to know about the neighbours?
Well, neighbours are important. First of all, you're choosing where you're going to live, and you're choosing your neighbours, and they're in a way choosing you, because if they'll freeze you out and make you not want to live there, then they've chosen not to have you as a neighbour. I have to tell you that I have never not had animosity from neighbours when I've self-built. Even the current plot that I'm building to live in forever, in inverted commas, one of the next door neighbours has been violently opposed and has done everything they can to throw up everything they can to stop me building. They've lost, I'm going to build, but they're going to be hostile. I know they're going to be hostile. I will win them over. At the moment, I'm altering their status quo. I'm changing everything. In 3 years' time, I will be the status quo. The house will be built, grounds will be planted, peace will be restored, and friendship is normally restored. On the last house I built in Gloucestershire, one particular neighbour shouted at us every time we got there in the morning, parked cars to stop us getting lorries up the lane, everything like that. When I left 2 years later, he was in tears because he was losing a good neighbour.
Well, this is an episode that has been very interesting. I know we can go deeper into this. Are there any other key points? I mean, even you rounded this up right at the beginning, but any other key points that we should mention before we wrap up?
I think covenants, again, this is not something that would put you off a plot unless there's a straightforward covenant, thou shalt not build. But even that's normally doable. You can get past that in many cases. But the covenant is important. Covenants are something that exists, that they attach to a piece of land. They attach to the deeds of a piece of land. And a covenant is something that gives somebody else on another piece of land rights over your piece of land, so that it can be a covenant that says, you shall not build. In many cases, you shall not build covenants have expired over time because the house that put the covenant on may have ceased to exist, or the people aren't there anymore, and just time's marched on, and that covenant, but the covenant is left there. And again, on that sort of situation, you can get a single premium indemnity policy, restrictive covenant indemnity policy, that in the unlikely event of someone arriving back from Australia and saying, I've been away for 30 years, why have you built that house there when I had a covenant not for you not to do it? It would pay them out and solve the situation. But you do have to look at covenants. In many cases, the covenants that most self-builders will come across, most self-build plots are carved from somebody else's garden. That somebody else who's giving up part of their garden is delighted to receive the money from you, but they're also slightly worried about what's going to be built there and how it's going to affect them and whether it's going to affect their values or the enjoyment of their property. And so what they do is they put covenants on the piece of land they're selling. Thou shalt not build any house with windows looking into my garden, so no windows to the east. Thou shalt not have opening windows on the top floor, things like that, just to preserve some of their privacy. Those sort of things are sacrosanct, and because there is a direct beneficiary living next door, it's very, very unusual that you can get those removed. There are other forms of covenant which are ransom covenants, where somebody has sold a piece of land in the past as a paddock, say, and they never wanted a house there, but they thought, I didn't want to sell him a paddock for a few £1,000s if one day he gets planning permission to build a large house on it and he makes a fortune. And that won't be fair because I own the land now. So what they do is they put a covenant on the land, an uplift clawback covenant. This I've come across in the house before last, where there was a clawback covenant where that exact same thing had happened. And there was a payment that had to be made to that previous vendor, that in the event of the land getting planning permission, he had to receive a certain amount of money, a third of its value actually, and that had to be paid. The important thing is, because we knew about that before we'd bought the land, that payment, that discharge of that covenant had to be paid by the vendor to me. So he had to pay off that covenant, not me. So that, to use easy figures, if there was a covenant which required a payment of a third of the value of the plot, and the plot was worth 100,000, that's £33,000. So if the plot's for sale for 100, you pay the vendor 70-odd thousand, and he pays the 30-odd thousand to the covenant holder.
Well, David, I always learn a lot when I speak to you, so thank you very much.
I don't know where it all comes from sometimes.
The show notes for this session are online, houseplanninghelp.com/117. You can skim through the main points or read the full transcript. And I'm going to embed a video as well of David. This is talking about the early stages of when you're looking for land, some great tips. This is one that my production company, Regen Media, made for Potton, and I think you'll find it very useful. If you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, we always encourage you to leave that at the bottom of the show notes. It will be obvious where. And once again, houseplanninghelp.com/117. Just tying in with today's episode, we've been talking about land, and I've just mentioned the video with David. We also have our own free course. It's a taster of the hub, really. That's what it's all about. And it's drawing information from all of the sources, all of the chats, and trying to put it in a logical sequence so that it will help, not getting too wordy or overwhelming you with lots and lots of information. It's just trying to be short, punchy, and useful. And these courses that we put online, we will constantly be refining, hopefully adding more videos in. I'd quite like to add my plot finding journey, take you through some slides at some point. I haven't got there yet, and add that to the Finding Land course to try and share some of the things and thoughts as I've looked at different plots, for better or for worse. Maybe I've got it wrong, but I think that would be interesting for you to see that process. So houseplanninghelp.com/hub, it's where you'll find all of that. We're done another time. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.